happy Friday. Welcome to Sci-Fi. Friday, Mari, is Psychoanalysis Day at Sublimation Media. So every Friday we interview a different person connected in some way to psychoanalysis, whether that's theorists, practitioners, or other more loosely connected people. So welcome. Please do consider, Elliot and I record a B-side now. So we've got a Patreon, which we use to pay for our... What do we use it to pay for, Elliot? Our lunches.
I use it. I with the sci-fi money, I pay. It's my food and my entire lifestyle. My luxurious lifestyle is all from. Oh no, I'm lying.
Paid for by you guys. No. We appreciate it. The other thing we want from the patrons is we on our B-sides we answer and talk about the things that you guys have suggested we talk about for the interview. So it's been really great that some of you have been listening and supporting us. So the link for that's in the description there. And we'll get on with the show. It's really great to be joined today by Mari Ruti. Mari Ruti's written I don't know how many, countless books on psychoanalysis, and she was a great help with my own first book, actually, from my PhD. She's a distinguished professor in critical theory at the University of Toronto. I don't know, how many books have you actually done, Mari?
13 are out, published, and one is under peer review right now, and another one is just about finished.
Great. So heading towards 15 books, there you go. But we're going to talk mainly about one of them today, a book from a couple of years ago called Penis Envy. Penis Envy and Other Bad Feelings. It's from Columbia University Press. Extremely interesting, provocative book about the question of penis envy and its kind of political and social implications today for feminism, for contemporary politics, and so on. So we're going to be talking about our penis envy. Elliot, are you suffering?
Am I suffering from penis envy? One of the things that's on the don't say that pile, I'll just start right off with it, is as a Jewish person, you wrote something about surrounded by, navigating kind of this, you didn't say it like this, the plethora of dicks.
I did say it that way. The sea of dicks, I think.
The sea of dicks, right. Navigating the sea of dicks. And I was as a Jewish person, this is how I relate to Christian holidays. So I can am okay, I'm on board. I'm so maybe not exactly the same thing, but I'm ready. Finally, psychoanalysis. We're finally talking about penises. We've been doing this show for quite a while, or symbolic penises. We haven't done penis envy.
It took 29 weeks to get to the topic of castration.
Isn't that so classic though? It took 29 weeks to get to the penis. There it is.
Let's start with what I wanted to do, Mari, is start with what you start with in the book yourself, which is to sort of talk about Freud and feminism, I guess, or Freud and as the idea that penis envy would be interpreted as a patriarchal or misogynist sort of trend in Freud's thinking, right? So going right back to that, if he starts saying that women are envious of penises, is this a way of making men superior or some kind of interpretation like that? Whereas what you're trying to do initially is just kind of dispel that and look instead for a kind of prehistory of feminism in Freud's ideas of castration and penis envy, as I understand it. So maybe you could just talk us through that kind of dispelling the myth around Freud and the associations of penis envy, and then we can get into it from there.
Okay, yeah, great. One of the places that this book arises from is my teaching. So for, the last 16 years or so, I have been teaching a course called Psychoanalysis and Literature. And in my case, it really just means psychoanalysis. There are a few films in there that I teach, but I don't really, quote unquote, do literature. But the fact is that every year I've had to try to convince undergraduate students that psychoanalysis is something worthy of studying, because their kind of knee-jerk reaction is when they hear the word Freud or psychoanalysis, the first thing they literally think of, two things. They know the fact that Freud was known to use cocaine, and they know about penis envy. And the assumption is immediately that he was a dreadful, horrible, just atrocious misogynist, because he claimed that, women envy the penis. And so the kind of opening premise of my book, and this is coming from a Lacanian place, the opening premise is to say, look, okay, if you take it literally, like if you take it in the sense of, I think when Freud talks about it in his text, one of his texts, he talks about how a little girl sees her brother's penis and then somehow gets envious of it. I mean, if you take it on that level, as a woman, it's pretty infuriating. And I tell the anecdote at the very beginning of the book where when I encountered that idea in college, I got so furious that I threw Freud's book across the room against the wall because I was just so angry. But then, after 2 or 3 decades of teaching feminist and queer theory, I've come to understand that actually it makes a lot of sense for him to make that argument if you think about it through a more symbolic lens, which is what Lacan gave us. In other words, if you realize that the penis is just kind of a cultural signifier of power, economic, political, and social power, then you would have to be kind of stupid not to envy it. So my question becomes less about, whether there is penis envy or whether it's a valid thing to even talk about, and more about, why are women and some men actually not more envious of it, because it's so clear that there are all these social, political, and cultural benefits that accrue to people who happen to have a penis, that it's pretty evident that there is this kind of a privilege that comes with it. So, of course, a reasonable thing to do would be to envy that privilege. So what I'm starting with is trying to kind of pry apart the penis from privilege and to say, well, actually what women are envious of, and also some men who can't live up to the expectations of what the penis represents in our culture,
right.
What they are envious of it is not the actual physical organ, but all the privilege that comes with that organ. And from that perspective, it makes perfect sense for women to have quote unquote bad feelings about it.
You look like you're about to say something, Elliot.
Well, yeah, I mean, you did write that in terms of what is the, this is the big Lacanian turn, right? Penis from the organ to the signifier, right? The penis is kind of like this authoritative key, and especially in the 19th century. I mean, the having a penis is the same thing as having kind of like a key card or an access card. So you have a penis, so now you have an access card to society to enter into the workforce in a certain capacity, to be seen in a certain capacity, right? Mm-hmm. So I think now we could definitely, there are, I think, arguments that people get caught up in, which you actually distinguish kind of from, which is like the human conditioned anxiety and kind of socially conditioned anxiety, right? So I think people get caught up in this argument. You talked a little bit about the kind of trans, genderqueer arguments of what is the significance of the penis and the, this individual kind of identity form. Do we have to pay fidelity to our physical bodies? But this is like not really the thing. It's really kind of a socially conditioned anxiety. So even if we do work through our own identity, we still have to deal with, Sartre would put it like the other people. You have to deal with the real other people and their kind of and what access you do have based on all these different identity signifiers, right? So I don't know the question, Alfie.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that brings up for me is that what I try to do in the book is to distinguish really clearly between kind of 2 levels of anxiety or 2 levels of lack. One would be the kind of lack in being that Lacan talks about, which is ontological and existential, and that cannot be cured in any way, regardless of how much you try. You're not going to be able to get away from those feelings.
I'm almost there. I'm almost covered up my lack entirely. I'm almost a whole being, I swear.
Yeah, right.
I'll overcome language itself.
Okay.
Just you wait. Eventually.
Yeah. Yeah. So,
sorry.
so I try to distinguish between that kind of lack on the one hand, and then sort of more context specific and historically specific types of lacks. And the whole penis envy thing is interesting, or the whole concept of the penis or the phallus is interesting in the sense that, Lacan kind of translates it into the universal condition of being castrated, in the sense that we are wounded by the signifier and we are rendered lacking from the inception of our lives, on the one hand. But then on the other hand, there is this very concrete level on which people people who have penises do have an access card. In the 19th century, they even had an access to like gentlemen's clubs and stuff like that. And certainly the workforce, like you said, and political power, the vote, everything revolved around whether you had it or did not have it. And so it made perfect sense for Freud to kind of fixate on that one component of human anatomy that seemed to kind of distinguish the people who had access and the people who did not have access. And of course, there are other kind of axes of power, such as race, that also functions as divisive factors. But there's something about the concreteness of the penis that has historically really determined the extent to which you do have access to certain kinds of social, economic, and political power. And so one of the things that I love about Lacan's work is the fact that he universalized castration and claimed that all of us are castrated in relation to this ideal of wholeness. And one reason I am a Lacanian is that I have always identified with that idea of a lack in being, of being dislocated and wounded and kind of just not being able to find my footing in the world, and realizing that that's the lot of everyone, including the men who think that they have absolute phallic power. So one of the things that Lacan showed was that even those guys, the ones who think that they are very powerful, ultimately aren't. So I'm trying to keep those two things in play simultaneously.
Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting, and I wanted to ask something about this question of lack, I guess, as well. But I mean, I think on what you just said, I mean, yeah, I agree. I think an important thing here is this idea. You say that queer, trans women, men, straight men all have penis envy. And this is important. The castration has happened to everyone. It's not a kind of those with the physical organ aren't castrated. It's this is like at the heart of it, I guess. But I guess I'm really interested in what you just said about two kinds of lack. One, which you're thinking of as like a fundamental Lacanian idea of lack. So everyone is a lacking subject and so on. And you talk about the phallic, the penis, as this kind of symbol of wholeness, which kind of promises to cover up this lack, or whatever, as Eliot was just saying. And then also when you're dealing with the other thing, though, that you just said is, when does the social historical context play a role in the functioning of lack, right? Because in a sense, that Lacanian model applies in every society and in every context, right? It isn't. So it's interesting when you were dealing with, say, for example, Todd McGowan's arguments about capitalism and the ideology of promise and things like that, where he kind of says that, capitalism is fundamentally sort of, basing itself, living off this lackingness and continuing to kind of offer this kind of promise of fulfillment, and it leaves you, like in Todd's terms, like it leaves you sort of almost always on the brink of fulfillment, almost on the brink of wholeness. But on the other hand, you're saying that because you also write about neoliberalism here and how neoliberalism organizes lack. So I guess my question is, to what extent is this lacking subject, this castrated subject, this subject seeking wholeness, the subject of just subjectivity, and to what extent is it the subject of neoliberalism or the subject of capitalism? To what extent is it universal, and to what extent is it like historically contingent or based on certain conditions of capitalism, patriarchy, you call it heteropatriarchy in your terms, or capitalism or neoliberalism, and to what extent is this just the condition of subjectivity as such?
Yeah, so really good question, and that's I mean, this question is something that I have grappled with throughout my work in a lot of my books, including more academic ones than this one. I think that, I mean, in my mind, there are basically two different versions of lack that coexist in the lives of, I would probably say, pretty much everyone in various ways. I do believe that lack in the Lacanian sense, ontological lack, symbolic castration, whatever you want to call it, the lack in being, I do believe that that is kind of a ontological, existential, universal human condition. And I understand that a lot of people have trouble with the idea of universalism, but I don't when it comes to this particular idea. I mean, ultimately, it really comes down to just basically saying that there is a degree of precariousness to human life that we cannot cure regardless of what we do and how much we try. So in that sense, it is universal. At the same time, there's this other level that is historically specific and context specific, circumstantial, that has to do with neoliberalism and capitalism and gender relations and racialization and sexual orientation and all kinds of axes of inequality. And so that type of lack is something that impacts different people with different degrees of intensity, meaning that, you know, some people are much more vulnerable in relation to that kind of lack than other people. You know, the Donald Trumps of the world are less vulnerable to this type of lack than a lot of the world's population. And so one of the things that has been really important to me, and I think this has to do with the fact that I grew up poor, one of the things that's been very important to me is keeping in mind that even though I believe in this kind of universal Lacanian lack, I also believe that there are other kinds of lacks that are sort of superimposed on that universal lack that are very differentiated in the sense that they do not impact everyone equally. And I often think that sometimes, I think that sometimes Lacanians and other critical theorists, when they talk about the universal type of lack in being, tend to forget about the other type of lack, which is why then people in feminist theory and queer theory and, say, affect theory get really angry at them. At the same time, people in those fields, in feminist theory, queer theory, and affect theory, tend to forget about the universal ontological lack, the kind of Lacanian lack that I keep insisting on. And one of the things I've been trying to do in my work is to kind of bring those two sides together and to say, look, these two kinds of lacks are not incompatible. And if we're going to really understand the human condition, we need to be able to look at them simultaneously, and also to understand that there might be a connection between the two sometimes, that sometimes there might be a circumstance where something happens to us on a concrete sort of circumstantial level, everyday level, that makes us wounded in a very sort of tangible way, but then also translates into a greater awareness of our ontological universal type of lack. So I don't think that these two things are necessarily completely disconnected. And my aim has always been to kind of think both of them simultaneously, and to keep in mind that on top of the universal Lacanian lack, there are other kinds of lacks that people can feel in incredibly wounding and injurious and just devastating ways. And sometimes I think that those kinds of sort of more circumstantial historical types of lacks that have to do with poverty or racialization or gender discrimination, I think that sometimes those are frankly more hurtful than the universal lack that Lacan talks about. I mean, that kind of an ontological lack is hard to deal with. Existential questions are difficult to grapple with. But at least my experience has been that they are still easier to deal with than something that is really just kind of like a result of discrimination or inequality.
It's so hard to talk about the scale of trauma And there's a similar discussion about disability, with the provocative kind of framework, the gentrification of disability, in terms of there is, in fact, severe disability where people have to be attended to a certain way. And then, one side is kind of saying, well, high functioning autism should not even be considered a disability. But then you talk to the other side and it's like, well, this is, of course, another huge problem, saying that because now these people aren't getting resources and you're just painting things over. And when you talk about this kind of degree of trauma, of kind of the social trauma and universal trauma, I mean, the question as a kind of, I am very ideologically ascribed American, and no matter how much theory, I cannot get over like these the ideological water like runs deep in some ways. And I think one of the things I always come back to, which is I think an Enlightenment idea or American idea, which is there is this dream that you can surpass all social trauma and get true equality somehow if we could only, on the reactionary side, not be so triggered or something like that. Or even on, the Marxist side, which is we should ignore these and attend only to class. There's, equal perspective. The question to you is, does the dream of equality go wrong? Which is less leading than the first question, which is, where does it go wrong? Like, where does this dream go wrong?
Yeah, well, I think I'm pretty clear in the book that I believe that it goes wrong most of the time. I mean, on the one hand, I kind of acknowledge my own complicity in the so-called American dream, or this idea that you can overcome all obstacles, in the sense that I'm kind of a textbook case for exactly the type of person for whom that has in some ways happened, in the sense that I come from very poor circumstances. My parents were working class, had 8th grade education, and I made a leap from that to, the Ivies and a professorship and all that. And so in some ways I have, quote unquote, lived the American dream, but I find the whole concept so incredibly problematic, in the sense that in exactly the way that Alfie was just implying when he was referring to Todd McGowan's work, which I love, in exactly that kind of way of like promising that if you just make an effort, if you make enough of an effort, eventually you'll get there, eventually you'll be rewarded. In that way, it creates this kind of a cruelly optimistic, to use Berlant's wording, cruelly optimistic ethos, where people are desperately trying to fulfill the requirements of the American dream, at the same time as the system is rigged in such a way that it's almost inevitable that they will fail. So very few people are able to kind of surmount the obstacles that are stacked against them. And one of the big problems with cruel optimism, or the American dream, or neoliberal capitalism, whatever you want to call it, is that it blames the individual for the failures, for their failures of obtaining success or obtaining whatever goals it is that they set for themselves. It's unwilling to recognize that there are structural forces that are keeping people from fulfilling the dreams that they have set for themselves.
Yeah.
So it shifts the blame from the system to the individual in ways that I think are very insidious.
Yeah, I mean, I want to try, I don't know, I'm just sort of thinking, I don't know if this works, but like try an idea, but one of the things that I preferred about my interpretation of your argument to my interpretation of Todd's argument, so these are both quite could be wrong, but and we've had Todd on as he's brilliant, of course, but what I think that you're saying differently is that you're saying that it's this part about optimism. I really enjoyed this section about optimism, the fact that one needs to, it's not about recognizing that you're a lacking subject, it's about having sufficient optimism to almost delude yourself into thinking that can be covered. So one has to be disavowing to a certain extent. Psychoanalysis is not about recognizing you're a lacking subject and accepting that. It's more about recognizing it and disavowing it, like in continuing to have sufficient optimism. And in this way, it's a slightly different take to Todd's, which is like, the pair of Nike trainers is a trick that capitalism's playing on you. Like, actually, there's something good about, I mean, tell me if I'm getting this completely wrong. There's something good about being in the illusion that the pair of Nike trainers are going to give you a sense of wholeness, because at least you've been able to live within this kind of delusional optimism that allows you to keep pursuing, keep desiring, keep living, keep trying to address your status as a lacking subject, right? Although, of course, you're never going to be whole.
Right.
Whereas, so I'm now thinking, based on what you just said, is it right in saying that that's where class comes in, right? Not everyone has everyone's a lacking subject. Not everyone has the material conditions to be an optimistic lacking subject, shall we say? Would that be sort of what you're saying?
Yes, exactly. It is. And first of all, I should say that I absolutely love Todd McGowan's work. He's one of the people who has most influenced my own thinking. But yes, ultimately, I'm saying that there are structural, socially generated impediments to certain people's ability to even try, if they try, they are kind of almost destined to fail in their attempt to reach the goals that they have set for themselves. So optimism is tricky, and I mean, I think that the one thing that Todd and I sort of interpret slightly differently, and I think that this is related to what you were saying. So let me just make this a little detour. I think that Todd tends to think that desire, like a lot of Lacanians, tends to think that desire is sort of fundamentally problematic. We have this lack, and because we have the lack, we have the desire to fulfill it, and then capitalism exploits our desire to fulfill the lack, and so we kind of become dupes of capitalism because it's the easiest way for us to kind of conceptualize how we might overcome our existential malaise. In principle, I agree with that, but I also tend to think that there are some forms of desire that are actually productive. And I think I kind of heard you saying something along these lines. I believe that there are some objects of desire that are actually worth desiring, and that not all desire has to do with this kind of a neo-capitalist or neoliberal capitalist attempt to disavow lack. But in fact, it has to do with what Lacan would call sublimation, with the idea that you can have desire in a way that then ends up elevating certain types of objects into the world to, like he says, to the dignity of the thing, so that, something in the world that you encounter becomes so important to you, becomes so kind of transcendently important to you that you fixate on it. And that kind of desire seems to bypass capitalism, at least it does for me. It doesn't really have anything to do with capitalism. So one example is someone told me the other day that, I would be a full professor whether I had written 3 books or 13, and that's true. And so I'm thinking, does that mean that I've been caught up in the neoliberal performance principle all these years, and I've been writing books just because I have bought into this idea that I'm supposed to improve my performance constantly? But I came to the conclusion that that's not the case. That I've been writing these books out of pure passion, out of jouissance, out of this kind of an excess desire that has nothing to do with the performance principle. And so I guess the short answer to your question is that I do think that there are certain forms of desire that are actually productive. There are certain kinds of optimism that can be productive, at the same time as I fully recognize, partly because of my own background, that there are people for whom certain types of hope certain types of optimism are completely unrealistic, so that they don't even have the mental space to think about things in those terms. They don't have the space to wonder about how their lives could be different, or how they could improve things, or how they could grapple with their existential lack. All of that is foreclosed by the attempt to survive.
Yeah, no, I think it's an interesting point. I feel myself sort of torn. I sort of want to sort of see both arguments at once, because on the one hand, I can see the point that this kind of what you call, I think through Laurent Ballant, cruel optimism, does require material conditions to exist, and some people are not in a position to be inside that structure of cruel optimism, which you kind of need to be a successful subject in certain ways. On the other hand, obviously, that kind of hope optimism is exactly what produces, in my example of the trainers, it's the trick that the trainers will provide wholeness, which allows them to create surplus value, I guess, which means that the hope and optimism that lack will be filled actually produces a kind of surplus value, which is then the means of exploitation for a working class. So I kind of feel like both things are true at once. Like, we do want the working class to have optimism, but also the optimism is part of the mechanism through which they're oppressed, I guess.
Absolutely. I agree with you, absolutely. And I agree with Todd's argument that capitalism in some sense reinforces our sense of lack. It reinforces our sense that something is missing in order to trick us into, buying more stuff. And so there is a kind of an inbuilt mechanism into capitalism that is designed to exploit our sense of lack. And one thing that I want to add about cruel optimism is that even people who cannot afford to be a part of that structure of affect in kind of a concrete way are still often attached to it in a kind of melancholy way of it being something that they hope that one day will become available for them. So even though they recognize that there's no way that they can realistically expect certain kinds of things from life, they still hope that at some point in their lives they will get to a position where those things become possible for them. And it's really complicated because it cuts both ways. It can be extremely exploitative and really kind of the kernel of how the system is how the system manages to draw the subject or the person into its net, and kind of keep them flailing and struggling on the one hand, but on the other hand, without a certain degree of optimism, things like social change become very difficult to conceive. And, Jose Munoz has this famous line where he says that the world in which we live is not enough, meaning that, it's good to recognize that there's something that is amiss in the world in which that we live in. And in some ways, the ability to understand that requires a certain degree of utopian thinking, which is why he ends up defending utopianism against, say, Lee Edelman's version of pessimism, where he's kind of saying, without a certain type of optimism, a utopian type of optimism, or even kind of an idealism, we can't really conceptualize the possibility of a different world, which then means that we are completely stuck in the social structures that exist currently.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I haven't thought about Lee Edelman in years. That's interesting. I also wanted to ask something a bit different about the question of gender, but I don't know if Eliot, do you have follow-ups on this stuff? Because that's a different.
You can ask your question. Yeah. The only comment I would have is that kind of melancholic relation to capitalism. I was just thinking that's kind of this essence of rap music. You hear critiques of rap music. It's all about money. It's all about this thing. And it's not really. It's about the melancholic relation to das Ding. Even after you obtain the object, it's still like a melancholic. You don't overcome the lack of kind of the social structure. Mm-hmm. So it's a very interesting idea, this kind of melancholic relationship to capital that lack produces. Anyway, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
No,
Alfie,
I guess that what I was going to ask as well about Mary is we haven't, there's so much in this book to cover, and we've only really sort of just started with one thread of it, which is fine. But I did want to ask about this question about, I mean, you it is in some senses a book about gender, and I guess your argument, which I found really interesting, is basically that we need to throw out gendered thinking. Right? You say, right, that at some point that the book's aiming to render gendered thinking obsolete or something like that. I mean, I think this is also really interesting, and you just mentioned Edelman, but like this also goes back to queer theory, and you mentioned your own history of teaching in gender and queer theory and so on. So this is also like I also studied English for my degrees and was mostly taught in the UK in this kind of tradition of queer theory and so on. It seems to me that this argument which comes from that tradition about rendering gendered thinking obsolete is at kind of a crisis point today, because we seem obsessed with gender and misgender and correct gender and dealing with this in a precisely a way that's, I mean, I'm not an expert in this, so I want to be like careful exactly what I say, but it seems that the hopefulness that we might render gendered thinking obsolete that came from queer theory has, in a way, the culture is trying to help people through this, but it's sort of taking it in an almost reverse direction. So I just wanted to ask what you thought about the situation today with this task of yours and others to render gender thinking obsolete, and where you think it's at in culture and society today, really.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Okay, so I was trained in the tradition of deconstructive feminism in the 90s. And the central premise of deconstructive feminism is precisely the idea that we need to be able to disrupt the gender binary. We just need to get rid of the whole damn binary, because it's at the root of all these horrible things that we have been kind of boxed into. I mean, when you have a binaristic understanding of gender, you end up coercively putting people into these boxes labeled male and female. And if someone doesn't quite fit, then that becomes a real problem. And that person really takes the brunt of kind of gender oppression, in the sense that they have to justify their existence. So from the perspective of my version of feminism, of deconstructive feminism, the idea has always been that it's the binary itself that is the problem. However, I mean, okay, so two things are happening. From the conservative side, there is a huge backlash against the possibility of disrupting the gender binary, because from the perspective of conservative thinking, it's one of the pillars of society. So that if you meddle with the gender binary, you basically meddle with the entire social structure, and that's what the conservatives do not want. That's a pretty straightforward kind of a knee-jerk reaction against, feminist efforts to undo gender. But then on the other hand, what's also happening on the left, partly because of issues related to transgender identities and other types of gender-specific. I don't know what to call them. Like people want to be recognized for the very specific ways in which they are gendered, and so it has become kind of a progressive issue again, or I don't know if it ever was a progressive issue before, but now it is, to pay attention to like this minutia of gender in a way that is it's pretty much antithetical to deconstructive feminism, in the sense that it does not want to deconstruct the binary. It wants to sort of pay very, very close attention to the various ways in which people are gendered, and people want to be recognized for those ways, and they want to be granted equal access to things based on difference rather than the demolition of the binary. And that puts someone like me in a very difficult position, because I continue to believe that the binary is the fundamental problem. That if we just got rid of the binary and allowed everyone to be whatever they want to be in terms of gender, and also in terms of just their overall identity, how they present themselves to the world, I think that we would automatically dissolve a lot of the problems that we currently have. At the same time, I understand the impulse of those whose gender presentations or in their from their perspective, whose gender identities have been suppressed or denigrated or marginalized in our society. I understand the impulse of those people to ask for recognition. So it's kind of like, I get it, I understand it. I politically speaking, I want to support. If someone feels like it's super important for them to be recognized for their particular gender presentation, I want to support that if it's coming from sort of a progressive place of trying to get recognition for an identity that has previously been denigrated. I get that. At the same time, I don't want to get away from my original kind of training and my original sort of very deeply held conviction that the binary itself is a problem. And this has also to do with the fact that I did not grow up in North American culture, that I grew up in Scandinavia, where the gender binary, at least when I was young, did not really exist in the same way. So when I came to the US, the biggest culture shock was the fact that people seemed really obsessed, like pathologically obsessed with gender in a way that I was not used to. I love the US in pretty much every other way. I mean, I don't love it now in terms of politics and everything. But when I first arrived in the 80s, there was a lot to like about American culture. But I thought people were just insane in terms of how they were fixated on gender and gender differences. And so some of my kind of antipathy toward the binary has to do with the fact that I know that another way of living is possible. I grew up in a culture where it was just not an issue. I never thought of myself as a gendered person before moving to the US. I never even thought about gender.
Can I ask a brief question? Because, for instance, my wife is very insistent on sexual dimorphism, not in like a reactionary way, but it's like, I am a woman. I've been subjected socially to these gender roles. I don't want to relinquish woman. And in fact, she sees the relinquishing and overcoming as kind of a male project. It's like, let's paint over the differences. Why is kind of queering gender roles progressive? What would you say to someone whose concern is that by destroying the binary, maybe in consciousness, we're actually kind of perpetuating the binary?
I don't think that getting rid of the gender binary means that someone who wants to identify as a woman and wants to hold on to certain components of quote-unquote femininity is in the wrong. The idea is precisely that you should be able to quote-unquote do gender in whatever way you want to, that it shouldn't matter. So if it's important for your wife to identify as a woman, and I also want to say that to kind of insert this kind of parenthetical statement here, which is that getting rid of the gender binary does not mean that we don't recognize the ways in which women have historically been subjected to marginalization and denigration and oppression. There is very much an awareness of the historical realities of the binary. The attempt to get rid of the binary is an attempt to get rid of all of those oppressive elements. But at the core of deconstructive feminism and my understanding of how the dissolution of the gender binary should take place is not about precluding any version of gender presentation. It just opens up the field in such a way that if someone wants to identify with a quote unquote feminine gender presentation or identity, that's totally fine. But then it should also be totally fine for someone not to want to do that, or to want to come across as a non-gendered person.
Sure, but sorry to interrupt. Can I ask one more hardball?
Yeah.
Right at the end, out of nowhere. Right. Isn't it not an issue of an identity, but as you kind of wrote, the social oppression of women? Isn't, if we try to overcome it in consciousness and not recognize the reality of womanhood, doesn't this perpetuate the social oppression of women in some way, or no? Maybe I'm
yeah. I mean, okay, so I can see why some people would argue that. I would argue the opposite, because there have been recent attempts in the popular sort of feminist movement to valorize femininity, to basically say, we don't want to get rid of the gender binary. We just want equal recognition for womanhood, and we want the world to understand that being a woman is just as good as being a man. My response to that would be that that's actually, and I mean, this is just something that you and your wife and I might have to agree to disagree on, because from my perspective,
she's gonna love this.
Yeah, because from my perspective, that's basically just upholding the heteropatriarchal system which created the binary in the first place. It's just trying to reverse the roles, in the sense that it's trying to valorize what has been denigrated, whereas from my perspective, the solution would be to just shadow the whole damn thing.
To overcome it rather than valorize, like the category itself is actually something to be transcended. Well, I think that'll be, people love their categories, like das Ding. For instance, like for Jewishness, for me, is definitely a das Ding.
Okay.
Even when it doesn't preclude access to things, it's like, if there's a Christmas decoration in my house, like a room, and there's not like one Jewish signifier, has nothing to do with that. It's purely symptomatic, which is why I think these discussions of anti-Semitism get so crazy, because like it really is, I just kind of reflecting on myself, it's like there is like a certain signification tree that you just kind of desire. So tricky question. Thank you for, sorry for just kind of bombarding.
No. I think that the perspective that you presented is a very common American or Anglo-American way of looking at gender, and so this may just come down to a cultural difference. Frankly, like I said, I grew up in a Scandinavian country where no one cares. I mean, now they do because they become Americanized, but when I was growing up, like no one cared about gender. It was a non-entity, and so. It just may be that it has to do with what you're used to. And certainly there are things about quote unquote femininity that can be very seductive for women.
I've experienced these sorts of things.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see how it's seductive, and I would never want to take that away. The point is not to take that away. The point is to say that it doesn't matter whether you want those things or not. Like it's up to you. It's up to you to decide how you want to enact your gender.
Right.
I mean, I do find. I mean, I know we should stop. But I do find. Oh, you need to go.
I actually have to go because I have a client. I'm so sorry.
Okay. That's okay.
I'm just gonna bombard and leave. Just like
that's okay.
What a scene.
Yeah.
It's Lacanian.
Okay, the short session.
Yeah, right. No, I mean, we'll stop. So I just wanted to comment. I do think it's extremely interesting to think about it in terms of deconstruction and the question of binary and so on, because, it really, and I get your point about self-identification and so on, but on the other hand, that you can have a binary with dozens of genders in it. It's not just two, so it seems to me that there's a difference between this kind of deconstructive queer theory approach, which looked like it was gaining ground in the 90s, which was, as you said, abolishing this set of, and then on the other hand, what you've witnessed in the US in a way you didn't in Europe, a kind of actually an attempt to keep the binary alive by adding more and more ones and zeros to it. So I think that's an extremely interesting kind of like framework for thinking about, just the situation with gender in American and British society, at least today in terms of that history of queer theory and deconstruction. I think it's really, really interesting, and you sort of explored that really, really well, I thought.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, are there any last things you want to say about this topic or about penis envy before I let you go, Mary?
I guess I just want to reinforce the idea that penis envy, in the way that I conceptualize it in this book, actually is not a gendered phenomenon. So here I come back to my attempt to disrupt the binary. I state very clearly in the book that I think that men as well as women and people gendered in various ways can quote unquote envy the privilege that comes from phallic power. So it's not about so much the penis itself, but about phallic power and phallic privilege, and that there are a lot of men in the world who also do not have access to that power. A lot of racialized men, and also a lot of men who have disavowed the kind of heteropatriarchal system that we belong to. Most of the men that I personally know, most of my friends and colleagues who happen to be men, do not identify with heteropatriarchy any more than I do. And they, for the most part, feel just as insufficient in relation to phallic power as I always have, or other women I've talked to always have. So it's really not about penis envy being about women envying men. It's about people who feel in various ways disempowered or marginalized, having bad feelings about the fact that other people seem to have the kinds of privileges that they don't have access to.
Yeah. No, okay. I think it's great, and I think that's right, and it's a really interesting book. I mean, people should really look at it. I mean, I guess that people will be interested in this topic because it's called penis envy, and everyone's got a bit of that and wants to have this kind of spicy chat. But it's actually a book about, as you said, a whole spectrum of, class issues and other kinds of social issues that we're dealing with today. So I really recommend people to read this book, and it's been really interesting to talk to you, Mari, about it, and you've given us lots to think about. So thanks for joining us on Sci-Fi, and it's lovely to have you on.
Okay, thank you, Alfie. Thanks for inviting me.
No, not at all. Anytime, and thanks everyone for listening as well. See you all next week. It'll be Todd McGowan next week, I think. So see you all next week.